Hello, everyone. This is Henry Schneider with the Business Performance Podcast. And today it's a distinct pleasure to talk with Tim Gohmann of the Behavioral Sciences Lab. Tim has been working in the area of behavioral economics for the past 10 to 15 years. And this coming spring in 2020, he will be teaching a class at the University of Texas on the same subject. So please welcome Tim to the Business Performance Podcast. So, Tim, would you please briefly describe the Behavioral Sciences Lab, the types of people or customers you work with, and the types of services you provide?
Henry, thank you so much. We really serve two different types of clients. The first type of client has tried every other mechanism of gathering and interpreting data, and that approach has failed for them. And they are searching for something else. They don't necessarily understand what behavioral economics is all about, but they are ready to try something else. The second type of client are new startups, and they usually don't collect any type of data other than behavioral. So they know what their customers are doing, but they don't know why. And so they ask us to come in and provide that understanding of their customer.
Okay. So are you familiar with Eric Ries and the Lean Startup?
I am, not directly, not personally, but do understand the concept.
Yeah, because he talks about vanity metrics, which is how many people you sign up in sales. But those are the things that are self-fulfilling prophecies, and it doesn't really help you out with improving your business.
Exactly, Henry. And I would classify employee engagement as one of those types of metrics.
Okay. All right. So when you talk to clients that you've been working with, what's important to them in terms of performance or quality?
Yeah, there really are two types of clients, Henry, that come to us for performance improvement. One type of client is that vanity-related effort, where they want to keep the status quo pretty much the same as it is now. They want to just not mess up, and they're willing to learn a little bit about the organization, but their primary objective is palliative. They want people to just be happy and be quiet and stay in their jobs and work away. And I can tell you that we dealt with a prospect like that for almost 12 months until we finally asked the question, what do you really want out of this? And the client said, what I want is what you want, but that's not what the CEO wants. And the net of it was she was trying over a year's period of time to sell in something that was more substantive and had a greater chance of actually accomplishing something than just a Gallup project on engagement. It was not able to, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, if you're not aligned with everybody, that's kind of difficult. So what are one or two of the biggest myths or misconceptions out there when it comes to trying to change the company's culture?
Yeah. The biggest myth is I, as the CEO, can legislate change. This is endowment bias in the behavioral economics world. And it is the assumption that due to your position in the company, you can, in fact, control the behavior of your subordinates. It's a little bit of an old-fashioned approach to personnel management, but many times it's actually begins and ends in the HR department, where the HR department simply takes an expedient approach, and that is to say, tell people what you want them to do. The second biggest fallacy, in my opinion, Henry, is that happiness equates to performance. And this is again related to the concept of engagement. Many people equate engagement with People's heads are down, they're working, they're not complaining, they must be happy. We have one client who wanted a project from us. We did that project. The technique that we use actually graded the organization. They received a grade of C. 2 years later, they came back. They wanted to have us evaluate the organization because they had spent those 2 years trying to improve engagement. And in the run-up to the project, the second project, they told us what great things they had done to improve the happiness of employees. Unfortunately, they scored nearly identically to the first time, meaning that happiness really had nothing to do with the expected performance of the organization. And a year later, after the second project, that was borne out by their actual performance.
Okay. So could you spend a few moments and just explain how you actually come up with a grade for the organization?
Yes, we have one approach, Henry, called culture grade, which is itself its own model. And when we collect data from the organization, from everyone in the organization, that data gets processed in the same way for every type of organization. And the scoring of that model has been predictive of the organization's actual performance. And so that distribution of scores, which is predictive of performance, gets divided up into 5 different grade levels, all the way from F to A.
Mm-hmm.
A being an organization that is responsible, follows a common set of rules, and in general are a high level of reward for the effort that they're putting into the.
So we're having some bandwidth problems. Can you start all over again with explaining the grades?
Sure, exactly. So, Henry, the grades are derived from a distribution of scores which the model produces. Scores at the upper end of the distribution are associated with high levels of actual performance in the organization. Scores at the bottom level are associated with very poor performance. So those scores are simply divided up into their own little sets of deciles and assigned a grade. And roughly 10% of those scores get an A, another 25% get a B, 35% get a C, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But scores are indicative of all of the various components that are impacting performance.
Okay.
And that's an easy way to differentiate not only the overall organization, but also departments within the organization. Because it's often the case that some folks are doing quite well, mm-hmm. and others are doing quite poorly. And this gives the stars a chance to be seen and heard.
Okay, wonderful. So when you go through the scoring, what's the biggest number one challenge then that people or companies are faced with trying to understand what to do?
Well, the biggest challenge is when they execute a survey, right? They get a series of results back, and they're often stymied in terms of taking action because the survey of necessity can't lay out different alternatives of action and their likelihood of success. So the survey itself can only take you as the perception of the folks that are being interviewed. And that's limited. They're going to just be able to describe their own experience, what frustrates them, what keeps them from performing better. They're not going to generate a concept or a strategy or even a tactic for management. So what we do with every project is we tag on a structured action planning process that normally begins with entry-level employees or level 1 employees, mm-hmm. and those results are then rolled up to middle management. So the middle managers have to act on the suggestions for improvement that the employees have come up with.
Okay. All right. So what are some of the common fears then you run into when you start talking to people? You have challenges, but then what are they afraid of when they start trying to work through this stuff?
Well, the most common fear is that somebody's going to catch those middle managers in poor performance.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that in an organization that's, let's say, at a C level, almost everyone in the organization is going to share some responsibility for that level of performance.
Mm-hmm.
So by taking what employees say and moving it up to the management level, what we do is we also spread that risk across the managers,
Mm-hmm.
spread that fear that someone's going to be singled out. And by forethought, we intentionally mix everyone up in those sessions,
Mm-hmm.
so that fickle finger of responsibility can't be pointed. And so this gives the managers a safe space to work together. It also allows them to focus on the problem and not their own egos.
Okay. So how are you and Ron and Christian and all, how do you approach it to make everybody feel good and accept what you're telling them?
Probably the one most important question you can ask, Henry. What we do is we have a process that involves the most senior managers. And that process really begins with understanding their own fears and how these data and this planning process can get them over those fears and frustrations.
Mm-hmm.
Let me give you an example.
Sure.
We have a large and very good client. It's a public convention space. You would know it immediately if I mentioned their name.
Mm-hmm.
We came in and executed the same kind of project, culture grade. And what we found was that the major impediment to performance was localized in one department. And we then realized that management had been trying to deal with that problem for many years, actually, and just wasn't able to do it, and was concerned that someone would uncover that problem. Well, once we uncovered it, then we knew how to solve it. And so we offered up that solution to management. And they were enormously grateful, really, that A, we found how to deal with it, and two, they weren't now having to deal with it. So this process has got to work for everyone, not just the entry level employee, the line level employee, or the middle management, but also the executive manager.
Okay. So you've worked a lot in the hospitality industry. So could you share a story about how you helped the Ritz-Carlton?
Well, you're very kind to ask that question. I was in charge of the travel practice for J.D. Power. In fact, I began that practice, and with all of the wonderful suggestions and requirements that RitzCarlton had and lived by, the one thing they were never quite sure of is exactly where was the source of reward for the everyday hotel employee. Was it the pay? Was it the social environment? Was it the set of rules that got followed? So we executed a project where we interviewed not only hotel staff, but also the guests. And we found an interesting result, and that was that roughly 40% of the, and I'll use a behavioral economics term, utility attached to that job came from the guest, from the feedback from the guest. And so the interaction between the staff member and the guest, which RitzCarlton is known for and promulgates and encourages, that really in many respects provides a very important source of motivation and value to the employee, and keeps the social system lubricated and working in the hotel. And although the math was fairly complex to get at the problem, everyone nodded their head and said, "Of course."
Makes sense.
That's what motivates me to do my job as a senior executive, to be able to do something that helps a guest or a party of guests and so forth. So kind of an expected but kind of ironic way to get at the same truth.
Okay, so what would you say is the moral of the story?
Well, Henry, you know, the moral of the story is to not have any ego yourself in the process. You are there as a dispassionate observer of the behavior of a patient that is asking for support. And to bring your own biases into that environment only limits you in terms of how well you can do that job. So we take the approach of being very humble in how we approach a client's problem, because we really don't know until we collect the data and analyze it what's actually happening.
So I'm going to poke a little bit at you and the people you're working with from the lab. When it comes to doing things, what are some of the common pitfalls or mistakes that you may have made in the past that you need to keep in mind in the future as you try to help clients?
Yeah, the number one mistake, which was more prevalent 20 years ago, is that I want to interview some subset of the employee base, or I want to sample from the employee base. These days, that's not right for a lot of different reasons. One is the marginal cost to interview everyone is so small that you lose the kind of participation coverage that you get from interviewing everyone. So you lose not only the goodness of the result, you also lose the goodwill of those that weren't interviewed. So that's the first mistake. Second mistake is to believe that you can write a question and get at exactly what the problem is. Okay, that's a vanity that we don't espouse, and in fact, we sometimes offer a second procedure called experience mapping, which doesn't use any of our own language or verbiage. And we do that intentionally because, again, we don't want to bias people assuming that we have the linguistic definitions that they use internally to describe whatever's happening. We let them describe it. So that's the second biggest, I think, mistake. The third biggest mistake, which is done on a regular basis, is to assume that one can construct some sort of external model of the data, and that model fits what's actually happening in the organization. That's an enormous set of assumptions. So you add those three things up, and what you have are a lot of spurious results, in my opinion, if you don't watch them, watch what you're doing.
So how do you account for different demographics like the Generation X and the Millennials and Generation Z? Because they're all going to come from perspectives on these surveys.
Yeah, they do have different, they do have different, what we would call experience sets, or ways of coming up with the definition of value in that job or in their role. So the first thing we do is we look at these groups individually, separately, and try to understand how they're different. And in culture grade, that's an easy technique. We just segregate them out and look at them. However, what's really the best way to do that is to let them formulate how they think about the experience using the same words that they use with themselves.
Okay.
So this allows us to use a vocabulary that they themselves use. And it is different.
Yeah. So how do you,
The three groups that you mentioned are, please, go ahead.
so how do you distinguish between what somebody actually believes versus what they perceive others think?
That is probably the second most important question you've asked. We have a qualitative process which begins the experience mapping part of our approach, which occurs in what we call a safe container. That is to say, we put people in an environment where we know that we get as much candor as we possibly can. The material which is generated is nonverbal in some cases, so people can't identify who it was that made the comment. So that makes them feel safe. The ability to not have to react to everyone else makes them feel safe. And maybe most importantly, which we found just 5 or 6 years ago, is that these folks need to be encouraged to actually deal with the problem themselves, because we've taught people to be passive and to not actually think critically about their own experience. So that's how we deal with that.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
So what advice would you give to people that are trying to make culture changes? Again, what works, what doesn't work?
Yeah. Well, I think the first and most important thing you want the culture to change, not what the culture is, but you want higher performance. Do you want people to be to receive more value, personal value from what it is they're doing? What are your own motivations for wanting this change to occur? Write those down, right? You're part of the change process if you have those sorts of expectations, right? And nothing will be successful unless you or the senior executive or the senior executive team is included, unless they're included in that definition. Secondly, I would say that it's likely that the solution to whatever it is that you want to happen is probably, you probably haven't thought of it already. Otherwise, you would have tried some or part of it. So don't disparage the solution that you yourself have not thought of, because that's the very reason why you ask someone else to assist you in that process.
Sure.
So those are the two ideas that I would offer.
Okay, so Tim, could you spend a few moments now telling our listeners about your backstory, and because you had a long career, and what defining moment inspired you to be an advocate for behavioral economics?
Well, Henry, that's another great question. And to be very direct with you, I was just unsatisfied with the degree to which a normal research approach could provide direction for the client to improve. It was a question of organizing the material in a way that not only made sense to the client, but also correctly modeled what was actually happening, either with the customer or with the employee, with the folks who were actually doing the job. So I was dissatisfied with that, and little by little gathered bits and pieces of techniques and got with other folks, Ron and Christian, as you know, who had a similar belief. And we tried a series of combinations to get us to a point where we were able to then validate the conclusions that we were making.
Okay, so let's think about, going way back over your life. Could you share an experience you had early on that still influences you today and how you approach work?
Well, that's an interesting question, Henry. I would say that that the answer to that question lies in my first real research job, which was as a rat lab caretaker in college. And I realized that the best time to run the rat experiments was when no other humans were around, because the other humans distracted the rats. And so I wound up working, doing my job after 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And I realized that I got the best results, the most consistent results, when there were no other distractions. And so this has been a little bit of my mantra in terms of how I approach a difficult problem or a task that I'm not familiar with, is to shut everything else out and just focus on that one thing.
Okay. So
I usually get away from
yeah, except now you don't have rats in a lab when you're working with big clients anymore. So.
Well, exactly. You, but that's still the way in which you approach the conclusions really, I think, require that sort of full concentration on the topic.
Yeah, you want to make certain you're getting good data so you can draw correct conclusions.
Exactly. And you're not distracted by something that's irrelevant to the task at hand. So,
okay. So how do you define success for the behavioral sciences lab?
Well, success in behavioral economics or behavioral science is, I would say, the acceptance of a common perspective, which, when it's applied to the customer or to the workforce, actually brings greater happiness, greater success. And it's that common perspective that makes it easy for people to work together in that environment. Obviously, the common perspective has to be accurate, or sufficiently accurate that people can work in it. But I think that's what the typical behavioral economist would say is their greatest delight, is that they found something that worked for both the people producing the service and the people receiving the service or product. And that would be a compliment to both.
So
Did that make sense?
Sure, yeah. And it sounds like it's not like the same thing will work here is going to work someplace else. It's all going to be depending upon the culture.
Exactly, Henry. The culture can be so different in one organization compared to another. We have 5 grades in culture grade, varying all the way from a culture of a kind of a slave driving culture to one of freedom and complete ability to serve not only the internal customer but the external customer.
Yeah. So do you have any measurable outcomes you can quote about what you've achieved?
Yes, I can quote. We follow Glassdoor on our customers, and we have one of our customers who used our experience mapping process made some rather immediate changes, almost within the week that the results were given to them. And so we've had cases in Glassdoor where the internal, the employee has stated that things got so much better after those changes were made that everyone felt better about their work, were more productive, and actually received a greater level of appreciation for what they were doing. So we knew that that was the case from the client, but it's nice to see an independent, so to speak, dispassionate kind of review like that.
So how do you filter out Glassdoor? Because you can get a lot of disgruntled people on there and just starts hammering away. How much does that really, can you believe of that information?
Well, I think it's more likely if the information that you see on there has a time course that jives with something that happened in the organization that you're aware of, an event, a change in policy. So this makes it appear to be more credible.
Okay.
Just people rating things excessively high, I think, is more likely the prevarication that you're describing.
Okay. All right. So here's another tough question. What's the most important thing your client asking themselves when they consider coming to the U.S. Behavioral Science Lab?
Henry, I didn't hear all of that. That we had a.
Let me try again. I know we've got some bandwidth issues here, and hopefully we can edit those out so it doesn't sound so bad.
Okay.
So let me try again. What's the most important question your customers should be asking when they consider using your services?
Yeah. The most important question, Henry, is have you calculated a payback by not making this investment?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if you simply straight line the current status of the organization and its performance, what are you leaving on the table without making some very modest investment in gathering the right data and organizing that data in a way that makes better sense and improves performance? So 9 times out of 10, that calculation is never made.
Okay.
And what you're left with is a supposition that something is going to improve. Now, I will tell you that the folks that are promoting engagement, in my opinion, contribute to the uncertainty as to whether or not, when someone goes through this data collection or a data collection process, whether or not they actually see success.
Mm-hmm.
So they're mortgaging everyone's future, not just their own, but their clients,
Mm-hmm.
by not doing something that actually is helpful.
Okay. So who are your major competitors in this field or space?
Now, the number one competitor is Gallup.
Mm-hmm.
Gallup has been, Gallup has a long track record of both personnel selection, engagement, and this really has been taking place over a 50-year period. Many of those techniques literally have not changed in 40 or more years.
Mm.
The assumption being that everyone uses the scales in exactly the same way that they did 40 years ago. Many times they are, Gallup is most attractive to those organizations that want a positive, shiny glow from the result.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the early days. SRI, which was the of the human resource part of Gallup, did some really remarkable work, and work that everyone at some point in time read about in their college or academic career. Most of that work is quite old.
Okay.
So that's the primary competitor.
Okay. So when you have clients, when they start realizing they need to do something, what questions should they be asked when they evaluate you against Gallup and the other companies that offer similar services?
Yeah, the number one way to evaluate a vendor is to talk to its clients.
Mm-hmm.
So we're very open about providing the names of our clients, if in fact our clients are guaranteed confidentiality in terms of what the issues were and actions they took. That's their own proprietary part of their business. But in terms of vouching for our credibility and our understanding of their own problem and the offering up of a solution to their problem, that's exactly what we would recommend.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
So, thank you. Now, here's another interesting question. If you had to start Behavioral Sciences Lab all over again from scratch, thinking about what you're doing today, what behaviors would you keep, and what would you do different?
Henry, we went down a path. We laughably call it the comfort path.
Mm-hmm.
We went down a path with many of the old techniques still involved, hoping that somehow, miraculously, they would produce the kind of result that we were looking for. And that wasted at least a year.
Wow.
So had we been totally honest with ourselves, we would have just started from scratch, as we eventually had to do.
Okay. All right, thank you. Now, after listening to this, if somebody says, hey, I want to talk to you guys, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you to learn more about behavioral economics and Behavioral Sciences Lab and Tim Gohmann?
Well, I think it's important to learn about everyone who's engaged in this effort with us. And the easiest way to do that is to go to our website. That's the behavioralsciencelab.com. All those words run together. And there's a way to contact us there. Our managing director, Christian Goy, is our lead person in terms of fielding questions or requests for information from our clients and prospects. And you can, on the website, we also have a fair number of studies that we've done ourselves just to demonstrate the kind of work that we do. So you'll get a feel for who we are and what we can do from the website.
Okay. All right, Tim, thank you so much for your time today. This is a fascinating story and just tip of the iceberg of behavioral economics, but this is really a different way of looking at things.
Henry, thank you for your interest and the chance to be with you tonight.
Okay, thank you.